Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next PA Forum session. We are delighted today to be joined by two fantastic people from We Create Space. We've got Michael with us. Hi, Michael.
Hi Daniel, how you doing?
And we've got Maylis as well. Hi, Maylis.
Hi Daniel, nice to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. For those of you, if you are watching, I had a great conversation with Michael at the beginning of the year in January, particularly about the LGBTQ plus community. It's quite hard to say that when you say it quickly. And we were talking about our backstories, where we've come from and kind of where we are now. And it really, really resonated with me. And I was really delighted that both of you will be able to join us today. So thank you. It's really nice to welcome you both.
Oh, thank you for having us.
You're welcome.
So, hello everyone. As Daniel's kind of said, my name's Michael and I'm the founder of Create Space. Maylis, do you want to say hello quickly?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Maylis. I almost forgot my name again. I was like saying something else. But yeah, it's Maylis and I'm the program director at Create Space.
So just to kind of give you an overview of Create Space, we're a global kind of retreat and workshop planning service, and we're based in the UK. We design bespoke self-care programs and well-being experiences for brands, businesses, and executives, both in person and virtually. And yeah, we actually set up We Create Space, which is our charity side to the business, last year on the back of our kind of leadership program called Who Am I? And Who Am I, as it kind of implies, is talking about identity and in particular kind of authenticity as well, which, you know, authenticity is something that I guess, you know, we talk a lot about at the minute. We hear a lot about it at work, but despite the kind of simplistic interpretation of what many businesses, you know, say is kind of just come as you are, there's a lot more to it than that, especially for marginalized communities. So authenticity, in kind of our opinion, means embracing and acknowledging every meaningful aspect of yourself. And so we can't talk about authenticity without talking about identity. Identity being the aspects that we choose to define who we are. So I'm just kind of going to ask you to write down the first 5 things that kind of come to mind when you're asked to kind of describe yourself. They can be the first 5 things that come to your mind, but if you were to introduce yourself to someone on this call that you're not going to be asked to share this, don't worry, but if you were going to kind of introduce yourself to someone that you didn't know on this call, what 5 kind of characteristics would you say? Just give you like 10 seconds. So if you're kind of looking at those 5 characteristics, would you use those same ones if you were introducing yourself to a new boss, for example? Would you describe yourself as those 5 things? Or if you were introducing yourself to your loved one's family, maybe? Or if you were asked on, you know, public television to introduce yourself, would you be happy to describe yourself as those things, perhaps at the doctor's? And perhaps some of those aspects you're noticing that you're born with, like race. Others might be developed, like your profession or perhaps your role within society, whether that's mother or daughter. But what you're probably noticing is that, you know, we're not the same person all the time. We don't portray the same kind of aspects in every situation. And those of us who are part of a minority group sometimes in public, we do this for safety and security. Certain aspects naturally play out more within our kind of family environment versus at work, for example. And the issue with authenticity for LGBTQ plus people is that many of us have spent large parts of our lives either suppressing aspects of ourselves out of fear of rejection from either our kind of families or society. And we learn very quickly who we should and shouldn't be from an early age in order to survive, to fit in. And this naturally evolves and often goes into include survival in the workplace, so to speak. Authenticity really requires us to look at ourselves with a critical eye, and perhaps look at aspects that we've suppressed. It's an ongoing process of continually removing the mask, let's say. So that just kind of give you a bit of a kind of insight into the kind of questioning that we go about. And really, I kind of just want to start by telling you a bit about my story. So I set up Create Space a few years ago, after burning out, doing my kind of corporate job. I needed to leave my job, actually. I needed to leave London. I needed to leave my friends. And everything that I had actually accumulated over a decade. I went from very quickly having my dream job and life to entering actually a period of depression, finding myself isolated, ashamed, and a bit lost. It became quite clear that I'd never once prioritized my health and well-being over my professional ambitions. And I actually had no idea who I was without my career. So that's just a plane going over. So I was forced very quickly to have to try and understand how the very same behaviors that had got me kind of recognition, success, and validation in my professional life had also kind of sent me on this self-destructive path and into, I mean, it was an internal kind of pit of despair and crisis, really, because I thought that I was being the very best version of myself, and I certainly managed to paint a very pretty picture of life externally, but on the inside, I was actually really struggling as I attempted to live up to being the very persona that I had created, and who on the outside I believed others now expected me to be. And I ended up working through my internal issues by myself, but it soon became clear that I wasn't the only one. I ended up sharing some of my story online and got just kind of an overwhelming response from others who were going through something similar. And then I started looking into some of the reasons why, and actually the figures that are out there from the research that's done. I mean, 46% of LGBTQ plus people experience depression at some point in their life, with 53% experiencing anxiety, and 32% have felt as though life is not worth living. These figures are quite shocking. In fact, an LGBTQ plus person is 3 times more likely to experience mental health challenges compared to the rest of society. And I really found that there was a lack of relevant preventative well-being solutions and spaces that resonated with me. I felt like the only time that we were expected to seek help was when we were in crisis. And so what we wanted to create with Who Am I initially was a space that not only addresses some of the unique needs of the community, but also celebrates and develops our unique strengths and talents that have actually come out of the adversity that we've been through as a community. So we work with an incredible team of LGBTQ plus professionals, and yeah, together we try and provide really relevant information and solutions and tools. And actually, I'm going to pass over to Maylis now because I've been talking a bit too much, but I'm going to ask her to introduce herself and maybe talk a bit about the program and some of the content.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. Every time actually I hear Michael speak, I'm either kind of like secretly giggling in the back of my mind because we've known each other for 10 years. And so we've seen each other across our journey, and it's always just fascinating to see where we are now. And so just to kind of tell you a bit about myself. So as I mentioned, I'm the program director, Create Space. Professionally, actually, I'm also a coach and consultant. And what I've been doing over the last 10 years is working at the intersection of creative industries, some, I would say, corporate clients that we've had in banking, etc., but primarily working with businesses, future leaders to embed practices and create spaces for conversations around mental health. And why is that? Is because it's actually been proven that having this openness at work to kind of take away or just kind of chip away at the stigma supports productivity and also creates a competitive advantage. But a bit more about myself and even why I did this shift in mental health is I started my career in fashion. And at the time I was quite young and I loved and thrived in that industry. But at the time I suffered from mental health issues, but it wasn't quite clear what those were. And I think it's one thing when you're in oblivion and you're kind of not well, but somehow the mind has this beautiful process of either sugarcoating, minimizing, or exaggerating what's going on. And for me, it took me a while to realize that a lot of the suffering I was experiencing was kind of marred by so many confusions and external conflict. For me, it was around intersectionality. And this is such a powerful word that comes up in the workplace quite a bit, but talking in my case, it was a lot to do with race, cultural background, and sexuality. So I grew up in the Ivory Coast in Côte d'Ivoire, and it's a lovely West African country, but I came here when I was 9. And at the time, there's nothing people really tell you when you leave a majority Black country and you come to the West. No one actually bothers to tell you that you're gonna realize that you're Black. And so that's something that became quite obvious for me at a really young age. And I didn't quite understand the struggles that other people who were born here, people of color, were facing necessarily, because I grew up with a lot of pride in how I was raised. But to a certain extent, I quickly realized that racism, even sexism, and primarily even around being LGBTQ, even questioning sexual identity, were things that everyone was facing here. And for me, my coping mechanism were addiction for a long time and functionally, but it was around where I actually had a drug-induced psychosis that led me to be arrested for 6 months and remanded. And in that moment, I actually call it this moment of clarity, because not only was I able to realize that I needed help, but I was also able to see that other people, other marginalized groups themselves had been suffering this or enduring this impact of trauma, and somehow found themselves in systems that no longer allowed them to move past it. And it was in that space that I started listening into what individuals needed across the board, and really fueled this mission to leave and get myself some help, but effectively support other people in this process. And so doing the work that I'm doing with Michael was pretty much, I would say, an ongoing journey of trying to facilitate those dots for me. But the key element, I think, is that a lot of time people in, I would say, maybe majority groups don't understand the fact that even in the healthcare system, and I can say for myself and a lot of people we've spoken with, is that sometimes the mental health experts are not always so versed in the unique needs of specific communities, whether they be around race or LGBTQ needs. And so when Michael and I just joined forces, it was about embedding this idea of diversity, but not just as this fluffy thing that we can all kind of hide behind and say, hey, look how, multiracial and multicultural our team are. It's about bringing individuals with lived experience, as Michael mentioned, LGBTQ mentors, therapists, holistic practitioners who can actually come and speak from that place of experience. Not, I would say, isolating any allies, but understanding that to do this work, for people to feel safe, there needs to be a level of psychological safety. And that is facilitated when individuals feel like there's a level of commonality and shared experience. And so to just kind of wrap up before we start talking a bit more about, I would say even maybe an issue that, or a question that maybe some of you have been asking, but, you know, why is it that, you know, how do we support LGBTQ people maybe in the workplace, or even understanding a bit more about these risks for mental health? I think the way we've decided to explore these programs that we deliver, whether it's the Who Am I program, which is primarily around identity, as Michael mentioned, or even the work that we do with We Create Space, which is the charity space whereby every other week we offer these well-being self-care workshops for people to come and do a bit of introspection, is that COVID has been a powerful time. Specifically for, I would say, the LGBTQ community, because we've noticed that some of us have had to go home. Some of us has probably had complete changes in even our support networks and how they work. And a lot of people have either found themselves back in isolation or even back with their families, where a lot of issues that stemmed from childhood, a lot of issues even of their own discomfort, or even simply having to face themselves, is something that was quite prevalent. And the discussions that we decided to have within the program and with the work that we do is unpacking this idea of the masks that we wear sometimes. And I saw the question or the answer in there about choosing to present ourselves, or really sometimes editing how much we show of ourselves depending on, you know, the environment and the background. But it's really interesting when either one of your aspects is something that you can't hide. For me, for example, you can very much see that I'm Black, but for other individuals, it's the way they present themselves or the way they express their identity that may cause a lot of trouble. And around these masks that we wear, we no longer have the safety of, you know, moving away or even reinventing ourselves at work and keeping some of the elements that may cause us shame or even the difficulties that we had. We wanted to share with people and businesses specifically to say that there's so much that we're asking of people at this moment in time, asking them to be authentic, asking them to show up as their whole selves, asking them to produce and to continue in the work that they do and supporting the business and its purpose. But we really need to pay attention about what's going on for them. And also the fact that when we really in this work decide to show up in unprecedented times when there's so many difficulties, it's important as well to acknowledge that the intersectionality, the race, the cultural background, even disabilities are so important to consider in whatever it is that we do. And these spaces, whether it's us through the work that we do, even encouraging other people in DEI, HR, or wherever they find themselves to bring about considerations for individuals who may not necessarily fit or tick the proverbial kind of, you know, generic boxes of identity and even their lived experience. So yeah, Michael, where do we go from here? I know we wanted to kind of discuss a bit more about LGBTQ mental health, but I was wondering if maybe anyone had any questions or anything else. Before we move on.
I think, well, if you don't mind me saying, I think it's a really powerful story. Both of you share such a really powerful story and a powerful message. I think Maylis, even just you saying, I've never thought of it like that before, that when you came here from the Ivory Coast, that you've even had to consider the fact that you're Black. You know, you would never have to think that, you know, I've never thought that anybody would have to think that about themselves, because if I go to the Ivory Coast, would I know that I'm white, you know? And I think that's just it's crazy to think that, isn't it, that you felt that way as well when you came here, but also the different things. I think when you're saying about the persona and how we are in, particularly how we present ourselves at work, it's really, really difficult in a COVID environment that we're not at work as well. We're on screen, and people make assumptions. I think sometimes when we're on a screen, they might make an assumption about your personality. You might not you know, want to have your camera on, for example, which is absolutely fine. But then suddenly when somebody does see you, you could become a completely different perception than what they've built up in their mind. So I think that's just an amazing point. So thank you for saying that as well. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I think we're still seeing a lot of stigma around mental health, especially at kind of leadership level. Because what we're seeing and hearing from our participants specifically is an ongoing struggle with kind of change, uncertainty, isolation, and really no one is exempt from this, from, you know, young people starting their career all the way up to senior execs. We've all been stripped of our routines, as Mela said, and, you know, our communities and our coping mechanisms, whether they be healthy or unhealthy. Yeah, as Mela says, you know, we've had participants who have had to return home to look after their families, but aren't necessarily out to their families. And so, as we kind of, you know, looked at earlier with regards to presenting different aspects of your identity, suddenly these individuals are almost back where they were as a child. And that is incredibly triggering. Trying to, you know, trying to be the person that your family expect you to be, or that you believe your family expect you to be. You know, many of them have dealt with isolation for large periods of time growing up, or been rejected by their family. So suddenly all of this unprocessed adversity is coming to the surface, and there's nowhere to run. You know, people can't leave the house, they can't close the door. As I think Mela said, you know, putting on the work mask that we're all quite used to, like everything's fine. But now well-being at work is actually well-being at home. They're one and the same thing. Our personal life is very much influencing how we show up in our professional life. So I think it's just important to recognize that all of these things going on in someone's kind of day-to-day or their personal life are bound to kind of, yeah, show up at work. And it's about creating I guess a space where these conversations can happen.
If you don't mind me asking, Michael, I think one thing that's probably all on our minds is, how do you initially go out and have those conversations? How do you create those conversations? Because it's so challenging. You know, you could be working in quite a large organization where they have lots of very, very set, they could be quite set in their ways with policies, procedures, and the way things work. If you're in more of an SME environment, you have more influence over how you can shape those programs and have those discussions. But I just wondered if both of you had any kind of hints and tips about how you can actually get those conversations going initially.
Yeah, maybe I'll just kind of start and then pass over to Melis, but I think you're exactly right. It does need a bit of a bespoke approach based on the industry sector that people are in, the size of the business, the location of the business. We're seeing kind of, yeah, really that all needs considering. ERGs are great if there are enough employees to create one. But you're right, if you're an SME, it might only be 1 or 2 employees that you know of who are needing that particular support. And I guess that's where businesses like us come in, because we provide that neutral ground where actually employees can kind of seek that extra support, or they can have those conversations, which we know even the kind of most progressive companies aren't having these conversations internally. So yes, maybe I'll pass over to Melis, who can specifically talk about having those challenging conversations.
Yeah, I think, as Michael said, just it's a difficult one, because when we imagine having conversations with someone that represent this idea of the other. I think for any human being, this is probably the most scary thing in the first place, because we don't want to offend people. We're thinking, oh my gosh, am I going to say something that's going to trigger them? And I think specifically even with what we're seeing on social media and cancel culture, everybody's worried about being completely discarded and shamed actually for just simply being curious. But with that in mind, I think an interesting level is really to understand the makeup of your organization and kind of seeing what groups are predominantly present, or even on a minority basis, what are these groups constructed of? What kind of individuals? What are their stories? And I know there's so much about disclosure and how many boxes you tick and, you know, what you say you are and how you identify. But on a certain level, it's about curiosity. And when curiosity is met with empathy, in our case, we've seen that we can actually start a conversation without putting words in people's mouths. So a lot of what we do on our programs, for example, and even on our workshop, is we give people the freedom to identify, to self-identify. We're not putting these tick boxes. Are you trans? Are you gay? Are you lesbian? Are you Black? You get to choose what that is. And we've had some of the most beautiful descriptions. I think it was Michael, someone saying that they were, I can't remember, it was something that was around spirituality that necessarily had nothing to do with the question, but it was up to them to say where they felt they stood in life. And this is what we try to have as a foundation to go off of. And again, in having these conversations, we found that the intersectionality piece is super essential. We don't really do a module. I mean, in terms of Who Am I, we can't do a retreat or a program without talking about that. As Michael mentioned, we've had people who have gone back home, but we've also have people who are still living in countries where it's still criminalized to be LGBT. And so we need to make considerations around that and how this may be impacting how they show up at work. But again, not forcing anyone to say, you need to be out and proud, you need to kind of go out there and literally claim space, but it has to be done so with a level of safety. So I would say for us, inquiry is always the best way forward, but we tend to pass the ball as well to the participants and the people we engage with to do that self-inquiry, to really reflect on questions that may trigger new alternatives of thinking about themselves, but also invite them to share. And a lot of what we do is creating spaces where everybody can come together and talk. So it actually elicits this level of, I'm being seen, but I'm also, or maybe might just hear some of myself in someone else's story. And on the practical level, I think to close on that is, it's come up often. And even in our last retreat, someone was talking about other solutions that could be more integrative in terms of these networks, whether it's the LGBT network, the BAME network, women's or disability. And they were talking about having more cross events across the networks rather than saying this one's going to focus on this one's going to focus on that. They were talking about inviting, or on some cases, not all the time, but creating joint ventures where all of these networks can meet and listen to one another and maybe draw some experiences. Because as I said, the intersectionality piece is so important. I may identify as a cis Black woman, but I can go to many networks at the same time, but in each can either feel like one aspect of myself is only being looked after, whereas if we all started to talk together, there could be a really interesting element of, again, collective curiosity that can blossom there.
Yeah. And I'm just going to put something in the chat, actually, that I found quite useful. Hopefully that sends. It was just something that I saw on LinkedIn, actually, but it kind of exemplifies the difference between diversity and equity and inclusion as well. But for example, it says diversity asks who's in the room, and equity responds who's trying to get in the room but can't, and whose presence in the room is under constant threat of erasure. And I think that's quite interesting to look at that, because it's not just about representation, it's also about the unique challenges of those minority groups and what they're facing on a day-to-day basis.
That's fantastic. Yeah, if you could share that with us, that would be brilliant. I've never heard it explained like that before. And I think, again, that just, I think if what we'll do is I'll stop the recording soon so we can share. But I think for me, it's instantly got the cogs ticking in my mind, because I think it's always been about how these situations, we treat them so delicately, and we it's human nature that we feel delicate about it because we never want to offend anybody. But I think understanding is so key, and I guess if we create those spaces for people to share their knowledge, share their story, share their background, but also encourage people to come and listen to those stories, that's where we learn and we educate so much more, isn't it? So I think that's fantastic. So thank you for sharing that, because that's great. So if you don't mind, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop the recording now, just to say thank you so much to Maylis and Michael for joining us. If anybody who is watching the recording would like any more information about Create Space, then please do contact me. I'll make sure I put the link on YouTube, and then you can also catch up, and I'll be very happy to introduce you to them. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.